M16, Type 1, the XM16, E1. When the U.S. Army finally agreed to adopt Eugene Stoner's rifle in the early 1960s, it refused to accept the design exactly as the Air Force had already fielded it, insisting on one specific addition first: a forward assist, a small plunger allowing a soldier to manually shove the bolt closed if fouling or a dirty chamber kept the return spring from doing that job on its own. That modified version received the designation XM16E1, with an initial November 1963 contract calling for 104,000 rifles, and it reached Army and Marine units in Vietnam through 1965 without any chrome lining in the barrel or chamber, a missing detail that would prove costly once the rifle actually reached the humid jungle environment it was being tested in. The Air Force, satisfied with the original design as delivered, kept using its own unmodified rifle, simply designated M16, meaning two visually similar but internally distinct rifles briefly served side by side across different branches of the same military at the exact same time. Compounding that missing chrome lining, the Army also swapped the ammunition's original specified powder for a different type already in mass production for other cartridges, a substitution that burned dirtier and fouled the action far faster than the rifle's designers had ever anticipated during earlier testing. That switch happened largely for logistical convenience, since the substitute powder was already being manufactured at scale for other NATO cartridges, and nobody involved in that procurement decision fully understood how differently it would behave inside a direct impingement action venting hot gas straight back into the receiver with every single shot fired downrange. Those two problems together, an unlined barrel prone to corrosion and ammunition that fouled the action unusually fast, combined to produce some of the most notorious jamming reports of the entire Vietnam War. Failures serious enough that a 1967 congressional inquiry investigated soldiers who reportedly died trying to clear a stuck rifle under fire. Marine Corps Representative James Howard even read a letter into the congressional record describing troops killed on Hill 881 specifically because their rifles had jammed during the firefight, a genuinely damning piece of testimony that helped force the military's hand on fixing the underlying problems rather than continuing to treat isolated field reports as unrelated incidents. That congressional pressure, combined with mounting casualty reports reaching lawmakers directly from soldiers' own families back home, proved far more effective at forcing genuine engineering changes than internal military channels alone had managed over the preceding several years. M16, Type 2. The M16-01. Fixing the XM16E1's reliability problems meant reworking the rifle from the inside out entirely, and the redesigned version, standardized in February 1967 as the M16A1, added a chrome-plated chamber and bore specifically to resist the corrosion and fouling that had plagued earlier production runs and cost soldiers' lives in the field before the underlying causes were ever properly understood. Colt also revised the buffer and gas system to slightly reduce the automatic rate of fire, adjusted bolt hardness and several small internal components, and added a raised fence around the magazine release specifically to stop soldiers from accidentally dropping a loaded magazine by brushing against their own gear in tight quarters. Just as important as the hardware itself, the Army finally issued a proper field cleaning kit alongside clear maintenance instructions, pairing the mechanical fixes with training that had been almost entirely absent during the XM16E1's disastrous introduction into a combat zone where soldiers genuinely didn't understand how differently this rifle needed to be maintained compared to older wood and steel designs. Demand from the escalating war proved so overwhelming that Colt alone couldn't keep up, forcing the Army to contract Harrington and Richardson and General Motors' High Dramatic Division to build nearly 750,000 additional M16A1 rifles between 1968 and 1971 just to arm the growing number of American and Allied troops carrying it. Quality control issues during that rapid production expansion actually contributed to some of the reliability complaints that persisted, even after the official fixes rolled out, since Colt's own manufacturing struggled at times to keep pace with contracts of that scale without introducing new inconsistencies of its own. The Army also finally distributed a cartoon-style maintenance comic, illustrated by future Mad Magazine artist Will Eisner, specifically because so many soldiers had never received any real training on cleaning a rifle whose direct impingement gas system genuinely did demand more upkeep than the older M14 it replaced. M16 Type 3, the M16 A2. By the late 1970s, NATO had standardized on a new, heavier 5.56mm round designed to improve penetration and long-range performance. And Colt developed the M16A2 specifically to handle that ammunition, adopting a faster rifling twist, a noticeably thicker barrel profile, and new round handguards that eliminated the earlier left and right specific parts the old triangular design had required for field replacement. The Marine Corps drove most of the actual design requirements, replacing full automatic fire entirely with a 3-round burst mode meant to conserve ammunition, and swapping the fixed combat sight for a fully adjustable target-style rear sight better suited to long-range marksmanship training. Eugene Stoner himself publicly disagreed with several of those exact changes after the fact, arguing the burst limiter was the worst possible compromise since his own testing showed 3 rounds actually kept a shooter's aim furthest from the target compared to other burst lengths, and that an adjustable target sight made more sense for a rifle range than an actual firefight. Stoner reportedly told historian Edward Ezell directly that the people making those decisions were target shooters at heart, more interested in turning the rifle into a precision instrument than preserving the combat-oriented simplicity he'd originally designed into the platform back in the late 1950s. Officially adopted by the Marine Corps in 1982 and the Army by 1986, the M16A2 became the standard American service rifle for nearly 2 decades, despite the very engineer who designed its predecessor calling several of its headline features a step in the wrong direction. Colt built the initial production run of 76,000 Emperor M16A2 rifles specifically for the Marine Corps, and the design's improved rifling twist meant it could finally stabilize the newer, heavier, NATO-standardized ammunition that older M16A1 barrels struggled to keep accurate at longer ranges. M16 Type 4, the M16A3. Not every branch followed the Marine Corps' burst fire preference, and the Navy specifically requested a version that kept the older, fully automatic trigger group instead of the M16A2's 3-round limiter, resulting in the M16A3, a rifle built to satisfy a genuinely different set of institutional priorities than the ones driving the Marine Corps' own version of the same platform. Built around the same thicker barrel, improved sights, and general external profile the M16A2 had already introduced, the M16A3 swapped that trigger group back to the M16A1 pattern, giving Navy units and select other users the choice between rapid, sustained automatic fire and standard semi-automatic shots without any burst limiter ever interrupting the trigger pull mid-engagement. The variant also introduced a flat-top upper receiver on some production runs, replacing the fixed carry handle with a Picatinny rail section that let units mount modern optics directly rather than relying exclusively on the rifle's iron sights for target acquisition. That flat-top design predated the similar rail system the Marine Corps would eventually adopt on its own M16A4 several years later, making the Navy's smaller-scale M16A3 an early proving ground for exactly the kind of accessory flexibility that would eventually become standard across the entire family. Produced in far smaller numbers than the mainstream M16A2, the M16A3 remains one of the lesser-known branches of the family tree specifically because it served a narrower set of units rather than becoming the default rifle for the entire U.S. military, making surviving examples genuinely uncommon compared to its far more widely issued siblings and a genuine curiosity among collectors who specialize in tracking the family's many smaller production branches. If you've ever wondered why 2 rifles that look nearly identical actually carry completely different internal trigger groups, that's exactly the kind of distinction this channel keeps sorting out. Subscribe if you want the next one. Explained the same way. M16 Type 5, the M16A4. The U.S. Marine Corps pushed the platform further into the modern era with the M16A4, replacing the fixed carry handle entirely with the full-length flat-top receiver and Picatinny rail, letting units mount magnified optics, red dots, and other modern sighting systems directly onto the rifle rather than settling for iron sights alone the way infantry had for the platform's entire prior service history. Paired with a Knight's Armament rail handguard system covering the barrel, the M16A4 gave individual Marines the same accessory flexibility special operations units had already been enjoying on other platforms for years, without changing the fundamental 20-inch barrel and 3-round burst configuration inherited from the M16A2. That modernization made the M16A4 the Marine Corps' standard infantry rifle through the 2000s and into the following decade, arming Marines through the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, even as the Army had already begun shifting the bulk of its own forces toward the shorter M4 Carbine platform instead, a divergence between the two services' preferred rifle length that would persist for the better part of 2 decades before eventually converging again. The Marine Corps eventually began its own transition away from the M16A4 too, gradually replacing it in frontline infantry units starting in 2017 with the M27, a piston-driven rifle originally developed as an automatic rifle rather than a standard-issue individual weapon. That switch marked a genuine philosophical shift for the Corps, moving away from a fixed-length rifle optimized for long-range marksmanship toward a shorter, more maneuverable platform, better suited to the close-quarters fighting Marines had actually been experiencing throughout years of urban combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. M16, Type 6, the M4 Carbine. Colt began developing a shortened version of the M16A2 in 1984, specifically for troops who needed something more compact than a full-length rifle. Tank crews, support personnel, and anyone whose daily job made a 20-inch barrel more of a liability than an asset. And the finished M4 Carbine received official Department of Defense adoption in 1994 after nearly a decade of prototyping and evaluation. Early prototypes carried over the M16A2's fixed carry handle before Colt eventually settled on the flat-top upper receiver design that would define every M4 variant going forward, a change driven directly by growing demand for mounting modern optics rather than relying on iron sights alone. Built around a 14.5-inch barrel and a collapsible stock, the M4 kept the same 3-round burst trigger group as the M16A2 it was directly derived from, but introduced a flat-top upper receiver as standard equipment from day one, meaning every M4 shipped ready to accept a Picatinny-mounted optic without any additional modification needed. The Army gradually shifted its entire active-duty force toward the M4 throughout the following decade, valuing the shorter, lighter carbine's handling advantage in vehicles, buildings, and the close urban fighting that defined much of the Iraq War, eventually making it the most widely issued individual weapon in the U.S. military by the mid-2000s. That widespread adoption also meant logistics and training pipelines across the entire Army standardized around a single carbine platform, simplifying spare parts inventories and armorer training compared to the more fragmented mix of full-length rifles and specialized carbines units had relied on throughout earlier decades. Colt initially held exclusive intellectual property rights over the M4's full technical data package, meaning the company remained the sole military supplier for over a decade until those rights expired in 2009, finally opening the contract up to competing manufacturers. That extended monopoly period drew real scrutiny from military procurement officials and eventually from Congress itself, since relying on a single manufacturer for the standard-issue rifle of an entire military branch carried genuine risk if Colt's own production capacity or pricing ever became a bottleneck during a period of sustained wartime demand across multiple simultaneous overseas deployments. M16, Type 7, the M4A1. U.S. Special Operations Command wanted more than the standard M4 offered from the very beginning, and the M4A1, adopted alongside the base M4 in 1994 and fielded starting in 1995, swapped the 3-round burst group for a genuine fully automatic trigger group and thickened the barrel profile to handle the additional heat that sustained automatic fire generates during a prolonged engagement. That heavier barrel let special operations units run the M4A1 considerably harder than a standard issue M4 without the same risk of overheating during extended engagements. A real operational advantage for units expecting to fire far more rounds per mission than a conventional infantry squad typically would over the course of a standard patrol. The first M4A1 carbines actually experienced their own early growing pains too, with initial barrels proving unable to reliably withstand the heat generated by sustained automatic fire without eventually cracking or bursting, a genuine reliability problem SOCOM had to work through with Colt before the platform earned the trust that would eventually make it the default weapon of America's most elite units. The platform kept evolving well past its original 1994 specification too, with the 2018 Upper Receiver Group Improved program replacing the barrel, handguard, and rail system with a lighter, free-floating Geissele design specifically built for U.S. Army Special Operations units chasing better accuracy and heat management without adding weight to an already heavily loaded operator's kit. That URG-1 upgrade also switched to MLOK as the primary accessory mounting system, moving away from the older, heavier quad-rail designs that had dominated special operations rifles throughout most of the 2000s and early 2010s. That same upgrade effort had already produced the SOP Mod Block 2 accessory package years earlier, bundling modern optics, lasers, and rail systems around the M4A1 platform well into the 2000s. Gradually transforming what began as a simple shortened rifle into a genuinely modular weapon system built around mission-specific accessory kits rather than a single fixed configuration issued the same way to every single unit regardless of that unit's actual operational requirements. M16. Type 8, the M7. After decades of relying on the same 5.56mm family, the U.S. Army selected Sig Sauer's MCX Spear in April 2022 to finally replace the M4 platform, chambering the new rifle in a considerably more powerful 6.8 by 51mm cartridge specifically developed to defeat modern body armor at ranges American forces reported struggling with during the global war on terror. Concerns about adversary body armor kept improving faster than 5.56mm ammunition could reliably defeat it, a gap Army planners identified as a genuine battlefield disadvantage that no amount of tweaking the existing cartridge could fully close, ultimately justifying an entirely new caliber rather than another incremental improvement to the family that had served since the 1960s. Originally designated the XM5 and then renamed XM7 after Colt objected that it still owned the M5 trademark for an unrelated carbine, the rifle finally received standard type classification as the M7 once initial fielding began in 2024, arming its first operational unit, the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell that same year. The entire next-generation squad weapon program also replaced the M249 squad automatic weapon alongside the rifle itself, fielding the companion XM250 light machine gun in the same 6.8mm chambering specifically, so a squad's rifles and support weapon could finally share identical ammunition rather than running two completely separate calibers side by side. Soldier feedback proved genuinely mixed almost immediately. Since the M7 runs noticeably heavier than the M4 it replaces and generates recoil closer to a traditional 7.62mm rifle. Complaints serious enough that the Army has already begun advancing a shorter, lighter carbine variant built on the exact same 6.8mm platform to address exactly that criticism from soldiers already fielding it. Whatever shape the replacement ultimately takes, the M7's adoption formally closes out a lineage stretching back to that first troubled XM16E1 contract in 1963. 6 decades of the same basic rifle family finally giving way to a new cartridge and a new manufacturer entirely after generations of American soldiers had trained, fought, and in some cases died carrying some version of the platform this entire video has traced from beginning to end. Sig Sauer, the same. Company already supplying the Army's M17 and M18 sidearms, now holds a contract worth nearly $5 billion for the rifle and light machine gun portions of the entire replacement program combined. A remarkable turnaround for a manufacturer that spent decades as a secondary player in the American military small arms market. Whether the Army sticks with the full-size M7 or eventually shifts its main procurement toward that lighter XM8 Carbine variant, the underlying decision to finally abandon the 5.56mm cartridge that had defined every single rifle covered in this video represents the most significant break in the family's entire 6-decade history.